Hi, my name is Josh Zoda, and I'm going over the paper Learning to Interpret Pointing Gestures with Time-of-Flight Cameras. This paper was authored by David Droschel, George Stuckler, and Sven Benke. And before I go over the main idea of this whole project, I'd like to go over the two main concepts that make up this project, which is gesture recognition and the time-of-flight cameras. The gesture recognition is the ability for a computer to take an image and other data and be able to interpret what body language is presented to it or a certain movement. And depending on what's presented to it, it can carry out a pre-programmed response or action that the user wanted the robot to do. And in order for it to do this, it has to use many different sensors, which includes the time-of-flight camera, infrared sensors, or simple motion detection can also work. Now, the time-of-flight camera is a specialized camera that is able to produce a field of depth. In order for it to do that, it uses many LEDs that will light up the room by emitting light, and the difference between when the light's emitted and when the light's received was how the camera is able to make up the field of depth. Now, also, the image has to be grayscale, because if it was colorized, that introduces more data, which is harder to process through. It also can distort the image, even though not to us, because it can also reflect light around the room, which then makes it really hard to determine where certain objects are. Now, the whole idea of the project was to make a robot that could identify users and identify certain gestures to be able to carry out a task the user wanted the robot to do. Now, how would you get the robot to be able to recognize a user? Well, they had to use a process called machine learning. And what that does is you train the robot by having it go through many different scenarios and telling the robot what's correct and what's incorrect, just like how a human would learn. So what they would do is have the robot try and find a user, and if it found, let's say, a pole instead of an actual human being, they would mark that as wrong. If they actually had the robot approach a human, because it recognized it, they could mark that as right. And over time, after many different scenarios, the robot would eventually learn the best way to find a human. Now, how does it actually take that image and then turn it into a recognition of a gesture? So first off, it has to be able to identify the user, and that's through the face. What it does is it takes that grayscale image and tries to find the face of the human. Once it does that, it's able to get the outline of the human, as we can see in Figure B. Next, it has to be able to find the size of your torso, or the width. And it does that so it can find your arms. Once after it finds your arms, it's able to break it into your joints, your shoulder, your elbow, and your hand. So this is the data from one of their tests. This is the green dots would be all the objects they had placed around the room. We can see that blue dot on the floor is the position of the user with respect to the robot. We also see the grayscaled image that's already been processed so that you can see what the robot sees. The robot can tell the human body out, and then it's also determined the face, which is by the yellow dot. The blue dot on the shoulder is the shoulder. We can see that little cyan dot, which is the elbow, and then the green dot being their hand. Using those dots, it's able to project vectors from the human body. We can see that yellow line coming from the head, which is the head-to-hand line. We can see the blue line is the shoulder-to-hand line. We have the red dotted line, which is the hand-elbow line. And these lines are all used for the robot to be able to figure out what object could you be pointing at. Not necessarily by which one hits an object, but through machine learning, it's able to calculate what object could you be pointing at. In order to test this, they had an experiment which used 16 different users with 24 gestures. These gestures were pre-programmed into the robot, so it wasn't something like flicking a wrist or just nodding towards something. It was something the robot had to be able to understand. They had 20 different objects placed all around the room at different heights. They did this so that the robot wouldn't look to the same height every time, but they also did it to regulate how high an object could be, because the robot obviously had to be able to reach the object for it to count. In this experiment, it was very important that they let the users pick the object. There was no specific order they had to follow. They could point to any object within the room, and the robot would be able to try and pick it up. They did this so that they couldn't pre-program the robot to go to certain areas and pick up the object, because that would defeat the purpose. Now this is a graph of the already trained robot, so it already went through multiple different scenarios and learned the best way to recognize a user and where they're pointing, or whatever gesture they're presenting the robot. Now we can see the elbow hand, the green bars, are really high in terms of error. And then we can see the yellow bars, the head to hand, are much lower in errors compared to everything else. We can tell that because when a human points at something, we don't use our elbow and hand as the line of where we're trying to point. We usually go from what we see to where we point. And that makes it easier for the robot to be able to find the object you're pointing at. And this is a robot that was not previously trained. It was just sent into the room, it found the user, and it just tried to use the vector lines that we previously spoke of to figure out the object. And as we can see, the data is all over the place, and it wasn't able to determine the correct object very efficiently. And so in conclusion, we can see that with machine learning, and with the gesture recognition, with the calculations of all the vector lines presented from those points, that the robot was able to more effectively find the object and correctly pick up the right one, as to what we can see with this one, where without any previous experience, the robot struggled to find the correct object. Thank you.